You've probably seen it, a room that looks orange when it really should be white, or a neutral colored wall that gets a green tint to it, or something very similar. Well, color is essential when it comes to professional real estate photography, yet it's often set incorrectly in camera and edited incorrectly also, even by professional real estate photographers. And why? Well, a big reason for this is that a lot of the modern cameras now provide so many white balance adjustments that it's often set incorrectly. A lot of those are for creative control, but they really don't help in genres like real estate where we really need to get correct colors. The other thing too is when we get to editing software, there are convenience tools that are provided, but those are often inaccurate. So what I want to do in this episode is I want to show how to set in camera the proper white balance settings, whether you're going to use HDR or whether you're going to use flambient. I want to show also how you can adjust white balance more accurately in editing software. And then along the way, I want to give you some other tips for nailing color every single time. Now, the hardest part of white balance overall is when we go inside. For exterior real estate photography, things are very straightforward, but inside is where it gets complicated. And that's because we have a variety of different light sources to deal with. Even if you were to shut off all the interior lights on the inside, you still have to deal with color temperature coming through the various glass, windows, sliders, things of that sort. And it's not going to be just your outside color temperature. You're going to be dealing with tint that's applied to the glass. And a lot of times you'll see like a green tint that comes through UV treated windows. When you turn the lights on then on the inside, then you have just a plethora of different color temperatures from each of these various light sources. Now I know that there is a genre of real estate photography where you turn all the lights off and then you don't have to worry about these problems. But you really don't have to do that, and a lot of clients really won't appreciate that. And if you take a look, for instance, at some of the highest end real estate photographers, for instance, like Brandon Barre. This is a guy I follow, love his work, and he travels around the world shooting hotels. He definitely sets the gold standard for a lot of real estate photography at the high end, and if you take a look through his portfolio, you'll see that he leaves on architectural lighting. And that is key. Now, if you're talking about table lamps and things like that that aren't property affecting items, then if they're bothering you, just turn them off. But built-in lighting, for instance, like ceiling cans, chandeliers, things of that sort, that is there for a purpose. It's part of the architecture and real estate that you're shooting, so those lights really should be on. Turning them off, you're really robbing the scene of some of its most important elements, and it really isn't necessary at all, no matter what method you're going to be doing, whether it's HDR or flambient. First, from a high level, before getting into the settings, before getting into the editing, talking about the high level here of flambient versus HDR, there is a difference in how we're going to be dealing with white balance, because if you're using flambient, and something if you're enrolled in my professional interior course, then you know that with flambient, those color problems go away because we're only using the luminance from ambient shots, not the color. And then the color is controlled by using flash, which then dominates the scene with a single color temperature so that we can get a more accurate color base, where then we apply then the luminance of ambient light onto it. That way we can get the natural light effect, but we don't have to worry about the various color temperatures. With HDR, you just have to remember that you're going to be dealing with ambient light in its totality. So whereas flambient dealt with ambient light's luminance but not color, with HDR you will be dealing with ambient light's luminance and all of its color for every single shot. So there are some steps that you do need to be aware of in how you set your white balance and also edit it, which we're going to get to here shortly in this tutorial. But one thing to be aware of is that a lot of editors, especially these outsourced editors, will try to solve this problem by just desaturating either the entire image or large portions of the image. And there's really no need to do that. There are other methods too where you can do lights on, lights off. You can layer various things where you have, for instance, different blending modes to make sure that it only lightens in certain areas but extracts just the luminance. But it all starts with your camera settings. We're going to cover that next. But before we do, I just wanted to mention real quick that if you did want to learn more about flambient and HDR and just real estate photography in general, I'd invite you to take a look at my courses on real estate photography. I've got courses that cover, as I mentioned, professional interior photography, expert editing. I've also got courses on business and marketing, videography, and I've also written best-selling books as well. And I have links to all that down in the description for this video. The first camera setting, no matter what you're doing, whether it's going to be HDR, whether it's going to be flambient, is you need to make sure that you are not shooting in JPEG, but you are shooting in RAW, and there's really good reason for that when it comes to white balance. White balance is actually an offset number that is abstracted in software by using those temp and tint adjustments that we're so familiar with. If they were used in their actual form like this color gamut, then it would be quite confusing. So having the ability to adjust temp and tint from the tools that adjust these colors in their relation to human perception, RAW files are endlessly flexible. If you're using JPEG, well, you could still kind of tweak that white balance setting, the tint setting just a little bit, but really at that point, it becomes a lot more difficult and you lose a lot of that flexibility. So it's already burned into that JPEG, and it's also then going to be a lower bit type of file. When you're working with RAW files, you typically have 14 bits of color, sometimes 16. The TIFFs are usually about 16. But when you're talking about JPEGs, it's 8 bits. That's a lot lower in color. So you don't have as much color overall that you can really work with to adjust. It's supposed to be a final product. Now let's take a look at the camera settings as they would differ between doing HDR or flambient. First, HDR camera settings for white balance, they're actually simpler in some regard than flambient. The problem is trying to find the right one. All you have to do with HDR when it comes to white balance is if you're using a mirrorless camera, you just watch the back screen and you look at what color looks about right. If you're trying to use auto white balance, you're going to struggle between each individual shot in a bracket, and then as you go shoot another frame or another shot of that entire area, perhaps just a different angle, different composition, well, your white balance could vary again. Your pictures will then vary from scene to scene to scene. From each photo, you're going to get a different one. So it's best to adjust it as you're seeing it. Use a manual Kelvin setting and then adjust that to where you see the white balance probably should be, at least getting it to a point where then you can do some of the color corrections that we'll talk about in editing software. Flambient, when we're talking about setting the white balance in your camera, that gets a little bit trickier. Now for the ambient shot, you don't have to worry about it because none of the color is going to be used. When you're talking about your various flash shots, that will differ between what you do to flash inside of a room and also what you do for window pulls. A lot of that has to do with the way that flash is going to be bouncing around the room. Now we think that, well, using flash, it's going to be emitting 5500 Kelvin, true. But the light that emits throughout the scene is going to be a totality of the colors in the room. So what happens is light will bounce off of, even if you're bouncing off a white ceiling, it's going to be hitting a dark floor, other colors of the wall, and then you're going to get one type of conglomerate of color that's going to be cast throughout the scene. I do suggest that you give auto white balance a try, but only use it temporarily until you get more up to speed and then start using a manual Kelvin setting. So if you're using though an auto white balance with flambient, and even if you were going to do this with HDR with auto white balance, is you have to be careful not to choose one that is too warm or too cool. As mentioned earlier, a lot of the modern cameras have so many white balance settings to give you all this creative control. But when it comes to commercial-based marketing material like real estate photography, usually that's not desired so much. So use something that is more neutral. Sometimes they'll have, for instance, on Nikon, a natural light auto, and that works very well. Or look for other ones that are more of like a neutral type of white balance. And you can test them all in your camera as well and see how well they work for you. But as mentioned earlier, since you're shooting in RAW, you have endless flexibility on adjusting that white balance later. The reason to try to get it as close as possible in camera is so that when you edit, or especially if someone else is going to edit that's never been to that property, they'll know approximately where those colors should be, and if the white balance is then just a little off, but not greatly off. For myself, I actually like to use manual Kelvin settings for doing flambient. Yes, it is a more advanced technique, but it can get you the exact white balance you want and keep it consistent for all of your shots. You could adjust it on your camera after taking a flash shot, or you can always wait until you're editing. But there are guidelines you can use as starting points, which are similar to the old days of using a CTO or CTB gel on a flash. And that's where a CTO, if you're familiar with these old gels from old school days, they would warm a flash, and CTB would cool a flash. Now, we don't use gels today. There really is no need, but the concept is similar since your flash is hitting the interior colors and spreading the dominant color of that space just like it were if a gel was over the flash. So basically, the warmer the tones in a room, the lower your white balance should be. The cooler the tones in the room, the higher your white balance should be. Most of the time, you'll set your white balance somewhere between 4000 to 5500 Kelvin, and of course, this can be adjusted in post. A general rule of thumb, though, is for warm colors, start at 4500 Kelvin for any warm dominated room with like earth tones. For cool colored rooms, start at about 5500 Kelvin, and then you've got a good starting point to adjust in post. This is something, though, by the way, that I cover in more detail in the Pro Interiors course, showing Kelvin settings for various room colors. But either way, all of these white balance settings, they're really just a starting point so that you have, once again, something to reference for yourself or for another editor when you get down to editing. And editing is really where it counts the most. Let's talk about that next. So when we're editing in software like Lightroom Classic, our first go-to is, of course, the white balance panel, and we're all familiar with the temp and tint sliders. Now, there are other options here that I want to talk about and also when to use them. So this is very important whether you're going to use flambient, like in this case, or you're going to use HDR. A lot of this applies to really both, because what we want to do is not so much adjust the white balance at the end. We want to be able to adjust the white balance and any other color problems before we apply any of our final adjustments. One of the reasons being is that we do have different color temperatures between the outside and the inside. Now, in this case, we did have views, so that was very important. I'll get to that in just a second. But here, this being a flambient image, you might think that, well, this is very color correct and HDR could get very close. I'm going to show you that it probably wouldn't. One of the things that we're up against is you will notice the walls are really not white. When we take a look at the crown molding, all of the trim, that is white, and you'll see there is a contrast between that and the walls. That's because this is a bright white, and then this is some other type of designer white. So same thing goes, you can see the difference between, for instance, the window frame and then the rest of the image. So let's take a look first, though, at an ambient shot. So this was the ambient shot that was taken for this flambient image. And then since it was flambient, I did a flash shot. There's a flash that's over here in the bathroom that's adjoining here, and then a flash near the camera. And that's why that's reflecting here. So I did a darken mode window pull here and then here. And this is where you can see I'm directing the flash at the window. And that then allows me to just have this pop automatically in Photoshop without cutting in the windows. But backing up here though, doing flambient by having just this one flash shot, then I've got pretty much one even color throughout because all the ambient light was knocked out before I did the flash. So all the ambient color was then pretty much eliminated. If we go back here to the ambient shot, we can see that this could be part of a bracket, but you can see that if you're going to do HDR and use a bracket, that there are a lot of various colors that are around here. So one trick you can do to see where you are just real quick is to just simply hover your mouse over the image. As you do, and you're hovering over parts of the image, you look at the RGB, which is underneath of the histogram. And you can then see then what colors are dominant. For instance, if I go up to the ceiling here, I can see that green, the G, is very high, and the blue, the B, is very low. So that tells me that this is probably warm and probably has a little bit too much green. And the green is going to be very common here because when we take a look, for instance, at the flambient shot, we can see there's a lot of green outside. So that's going to be casting in. So we can see that here. So you'd want to adjust this and all the other images in the bracket in the similar way that I'm going to do here for the flambient shot. This is the flash shot. And if we take a look before I made the color adjustments, which were here, it's very slight, very different. Notice what I did here. This really didn't need that 4500 Kelvin starting point, even though it had a warm floor. It has mostly cool color temperatures because the white of the ceiling and the whiteness of, for instance, the wall paint. So I started when I was shooting at 5000 Kelvin. Lightroom Classic picked it up as 50/50, and that's very typical to be off a little bit in software because it's trying to interpret an offset number. It's not really burned into the software what this is, it's an abstraction. Anyways, very close here, basically about 5000 Kelvin. But I could see that if I moused over here, that I'm getting greens showing up. So the greens are just a little on the high side. So at this point, that's where I adjusted the tint, and I only took the tint up from 11 to 13. Doing that then really evened out the color temperatures just a little bit more. I could maybe go just a little higher on the green, but I left it right there for now. But a big one here is that I don't want to use this same color temperature for my window pulls. Whether you're doing these flashed window pulls for using a darken mode window pull, you don't want to use probably the same color temperature. That's because you're directing the flash directly toward the windows in these cases. And when you were doing the flash shot, when you're doing flambient, then it's bouncing all over the place. And so you're gonna get a different type of color cast. So here I used a 5200 for the white balance. Now, if you're doing HDR, it'd probably be the same way because let's go back to our ambient shot. If I were to take this ambient shot and I were to get it to where it probably should be, which I'd probably have to drop then the white balance down, let's say to about 4000 or so, might have to then adjust the tint. Well, if it were about 4000, that's not going to be what the outside view is. So you want to make sure that when you're doing HDR, if you're just simply knocking off brackets, well, you're going to have to adjust then, if you have a window pull of something to cut in your windows later, that it has the proper color temperature, not for the inside, but for the outside. Now for flambient, the white balance does not matter at all for the ambient shot. That's thrown away, and then the color is used from the flashed shot, and only the luminance is used from the ambient shot to give us that flambient look. Now there are two other misconceptions about some of the tools over here that you could use for white balance adjustments, and that's the dropper and also whether you would use something in auto mode. Now even other programs beside Lightroom Classic have these tools. Let's go over here, for instance, to our ambient shot. Let's start with something that you might use for HDR. Let's take it back to where it was before we made our adjustments manually. If I were to use the eyedropper, one of the problems is what is supposed to be neutral. Now, a lot of people think, well, white ceilings are white, or for instance, over here, this is bright white. You could click on that. If you do, though, look at what happened. It really turned it red. The magenta went up to 32. Well, that's just way too high. The more I click around on different areas that I think are supposed to be white, I'm going to keep getting different results. So this is really not an accurate method to adjust your white balance. The other thing too that's often thought is, well, I could just do an auto adjustment here, which sometimes that will work. You can see here it warmed it up. And the problem is that there were so many casts of color coming through this. If we go back here to originally where it was, it's just myriad colors that are throughout here. And it's not so much just from the interior lights, which there is some difference over here too in the bathroom, even though it's darker, but where there's so many color casts that are coming from the outside. So even in a case like this where you could do lights off for this if you were doing HDR, although you'd have a problem with the bathroom over here, then with the lights off, you're still having tons of problems with these other colors that are streaming in. It's not just going to be blue from the sky, it's going to be also green from the outside and whatever colors are on the patio, and probably even a little bit of red from this particular umbrella. Even if we tried those type of adjustments here in a flash shot, they usually don't go very well. If I were to click the ceiling, for instance, now that just went way too unnatural and it went way too high into the magentas. If I tried it over here, that got a little bit closer, but it's still not accurate. You can see it's at 5000, which was good. It went up to 19. Got it maybe just a little bit too much in the magenta, and that's why I wanted to start here and felt this was definitely more natural looking. If I try to do an auto adjustment on this flash shot, you can see it warmed it up way too much. So these aren't all that accurate. That's why I suggest If something doesn't look right to you, then just hover your mouse over it and see what happens with those RGB settings over underneath the histogram. This is also why it's so critical to try to get your white balance very, very close while you're on site, while you're shooting it. Don't try to just adjust this later in post, because you'll be so far off you won't remember, well, what paint color was used in this house, and that would be extremely hard also if you're outsourcing your editing. And speaking of outsourcing editing, this would be something that would be commonly desaturated quite a bit. We don't want to do that. There is no need for that. There are a lot of ways to control color when we're over in Photoshop and doing editing. And let's take a look at that next. Here in Photoshop, we've got the various layers loaded up here to do our flambient blending. So we had our flash shot here, our ambient shot was here, and of course, I just didn't use any ambient light in the bathroom because that was just so dark. So I lit it up with flash. I didn't need the ambient light, which would have made it really dark. So that's another advantage of using flash. When you control the light, you control the image. Then I did the darken mode window pull and did it here, and since we had a little bit of reflection, I did the other one here. If you take a look at what was done here, it was just simply cutting out the entire window. I didn't have to cut out, worry about the frames, nothing. This is the beauty of doing darken mode window pulls. You can get real sloppy around those areas, and it's still going to bring that view right through. But there still are some color issues here, and they're very minor, but it really applies whether it's going to be something minor here or something major that you really do need to correct. And there are a number of ways to deal with this that I show, for instance, in the expert editing course. But the key here is that if you're going to be changing the color of this room, you don't want to change the color of the windows. So the color adjustments that you want to do should be below your windows. So you would want to start your color adjustments here. Now, one way in Photoshop is to see if you've got the correct colors someplace, is similar to using the mouse over technique in Lightroom Classic, is that you can take the eyedropper. You could select, for instance, the foreground color picker, and you could start clicking around and seeing then what colors you're seeing throughout the space. So here I can still see that I'm a little high on the greens and I'm a little high on the blues, but I do want some warmth in the picture, but I don't want that much green in the picture. Now, another way too, more advanced technique if you're doing architectural photography, is to apply some color points. And what you can do here is under the eyedropper tool over here on the menu, you would select Color Sample Tool. And then you would select a few different points here to see where your colors are. And if you have your info panel open, you can see what the R, G, and B are for those various points. Next, you could then take something like an adjustment layer and see what the adjustments look like before or after. So here in this case, I could put, let's just say, a color balance layer, just as something to just change a small shift in those greens and also maybe just cool it off just a tad. If I did that, I could go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and let's take a color balance layer. I'm going to put it into color blending mode to make sure that it doesn't affect any luminance. So I'll say OK. And in here then, remember our greens were a little high, so I might want to just drop the magenta down just a tad. And as I do, I can see if anything changed. The numbers on the left are the before, and the numbers on the right are the after the adjustment, if you're on the adjustment layer. So I could still bring this down until I start seeing the green is starting to go down a little bit. You can see here it went down on point number 3 and also point number 2. It was also a little on the warm side, so I might decide to cool it. Instead of taking it from reds, I'll take the reds just into the blues just a tad. And then I can see some of the adjustments then that are done here, because before we were at 208, we went to 210 on the blues, and the same thing here. So now we've got some very minor adjustments that were done, but they were done below the window pulls. So I'm only adjusting things but the windows. If I turn this layer off, this is what it looked like before. Turn it on, this is with it after. Now these are very, very minor adjustments here, but they could be a lot greater depending on the color casts that you're up against. And of course, that's just one method. That does take more time. There are a lot of other methods like I talk about in the expert editing course. But after all our editing is done, no matter what color methods we used and what other color changes that we did through all of our editing, When we're done and we're ready to then put this out to the customer and we've made all of our final adjustments, if you wanted to still make some white balance adjustments, you could, but remember, these are going to be global. And the same thing goes if you are going to be using other adjustment tools. For instance, a common thing that editors will use is they will use something like the color mixer, and they will take the saturation of the oranges and the reds and they'll just drop those. Well, if you do that to try to get rid of your warmth, you could start affecting other areas. For instance, here, yes, I got rid of some of the warmth in the walls, but immediately this umbrella turned black. So we don't want to do that. We want to bring that back. So this is where it's really not advisable to make these massive color adjustments, shifting your color, or even making a lot of adjustments with your white balance sliders once you've edited your photos. The key is to make those color adjustments, whether it's white balance or otherwise, to do those before you have your final image blended, whether that's HDR or whether it's flambient. Do those beforehand. Make sure that all of your color corrections are done to the appropriate layers so that you can keep the outside different from the inside, or even other rooms different from other rooms that you're working with. And then, once you have everything blended, if still something is not quite right, a few tweaks one way or the other really wouldn't matter so much, but try to keep them minimal before you do your final export. And one last thing really to emphasize this and drive this home is that don't wait until your next shoot to try this. Take some existing footage, or if you don't have any and you're just starting out, try to do some real estate photography just wherever you are, the room that you're sitting in right now, and practice this. You want to make sure that you practice this before you get out there. That way you know what you can set your camera to, which is very important as you're out in the field and you don't want to start second guessing yourself. You also want to make sure then that you can make your adjustments prior to doing any blending and do those properly with the right color adjustments, and then be ready at the final stages to make the right adjustments based on everything that you did through the entire process of thought to finish.